I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Hassan Ould Moctar, which will present a paper titled Digital Resources Frontier and Border Externalization in Mauritania. Dr. Hassan Ould Moctar is a writer and a researcher and works on the relationship between migration, borders, and development processes, in particular with a focus on Mauritania, West African, Sahel, and Sahara. He has a PhD from the Development Studies Department at SOAS, University of London, and has held fellowship in SOAS and at the London School of Economics and Political Sciences. His work has been published in extremely important academic journals, such as Environment and Planning D, Geoforum, and Anthropologie et Développement, as well as in media outlets such as Al Jazeera and Open Democracy. His monography is forthcoming, so keep an eye on that. And the title is After Externalization, Migration, Race and Labor in Mauritania. So thank you very much, Hassan, again for being with us, and the floor is yours. And of course, you can share the PowerPoint.
Of course, thank you. And yes, thank you so much for the kind introduction, the kind words, and for the invitation. By the sounds of what you guys are doing, I see some very interesting kind of overlaps between the research that I'm doing in general and what I'll be sharing today, and the activities of POMAF. So I'm going to just share my screen, and okay, so hopefully you guys can see that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. So this shouldn't take more than 20-25 minutes, but by all means do feel free to interrupt me if and when I do run out of time. So as mentioned, I'm going to be sharing a piece from a paper that's very much in its early stages, so any and all dense and detailed questions will be very much welcome. As you can see, the piece is entitled Digital Resource Frontiers and Border Externalization in Mauritania. And in very kind of broad terms, what I want to try and do is trace the relationship between a biometric overhaul of the Mauritanian civil registry system, which took place in 2012, and the process of EU border externalization that has been ongoing in the country since roughly 2006. And in tracing this relationship, what I'm going to try to demonstrate is that non-EU state agency, and in this case Mauritanian state agency, can and does manipulate and appropriate the technologies of externalization for its own purposes. And at the same time, in doing so, even it can perhaps ironically reproduce certain kind of broader neo-colonial dynamics of uneven development and kind of center-periphery dynamics between Europe and Africa. Now, kind of making this case, I'll be drawing from 11 months of fieldwork, some fieldwork data carried out in Mauritania between 2017 and 2018. And I find myself saying this quite a bit in presentations lately. I'm kind of revisiting that fieldwork data in light of things that I've been thinking about since then. So apologies for kind of any disconnects between the empirics and the argument that I'm trying to make. And again, any thoughts and suggestions about how to tighten that connection would be very much welcome. To quickly just start with some kind of broad scholarly perspectives to give a sense of the conceptual framework that I'm drawing upon. So obviously I'm looking at the literature, the quite vast literature on externalization in West Africa and North Africa that's come out over the past 20 years at this point. And the citations here, obviously just a small cursory overview. And I'm bringing these into dialogue with certain Marxist perspectives on EU border policy in West Africa and in North Africa. People like Hannah Cross, who talk about this regime of unfree labor mobility that Spanish and EU border policies create in Mauritania and in Senegal. Other kind of more imperialist frames that talk about the production of surplus populations by migration and border policies in places like Libya, which creates surplus cheap surplus populations for agricultural sectors in Southern Europe. And while these perspectives, I think, are welcome in that they give a much needed kind of political economy perspective on migration and border policies, I find that the question of the state agency, state transformation is left kind of unproblematized, perhaps because of this Marxist assumption of the economic base and the political superstructure, and the base is always the determinant of the superstructure. This might be where this oversight comes from. Now, on the other hand, there are a number of post-colonial, non-Eurocentric, non-Western perspectives on migration or border policies, which do really center this question of state agency, non-EU state agency in particular, and shows there is quite a significant room for maneuver on the part of those state actors, and for kind of unexpected outcomes as a result of this state agency. But on the other hand, there isn't as much attention to the questions of political economy and uneven development, macro scale developmental processes that we have within these Marxist perspectives. So this is broadly what I'm trying to do, is kind of bring these into a productive dialogue through this examination of the civil registry and the externalization process in Mauritania. Okay, so just to quickly give a bit of context, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I assume people are broadly familiar with this background, but we might trace the origins of externalization in Mauritania to the year 2006, when upwards of 32,000 people arrive on the Canary Islands from West African shores. This results in a range of measures taken by both Spanish security forces and eventually Frontex. And it's kind of these measures, which include the interception and detention of people at sea in the Canary Islands and on Mauritania, are enabled by a readmission agreement that has been signed between Mauritania and Spain in 2003, which might be a kind of earlier precursor to externalization in Mauritania. As people are aware, Operation Hera, the Frontex Operation Hera, is launched as a response. It's the maiden mission of Frontex, which was only created 2 years previously. It initially involved a small deployment on the Canary Islands, which then expands into a more ambitious operation, which is depicted here on the left, involving naval and aerial patrols to intercept vessels at sea, and the training of Mauritanian security forces, capacity building geared towards identifying and detaining and deporting so-called irregular migrants, or even people suspected of wanting to migrate from the northern port city of Nouadhibou. So amongst many of the consequences and outcomes associated with this very ambitious policing operation, we can see on the graph on the right a vast increase in the number of people deported from Mauritanian state territory between 2005 and 2006, creating a newfound fear of and possibility of being deported from state territory on the grounds of one's residency status, in a fashion that departs quite significantly from the state of immigration policy implementation in Mauritania in previous years. So in 2010, when the so-called crisis on the Canary Islands had momentarily dissipated, the Mauritanian government and their European partners take the opportunity to kind of embark on a much more ambitious and what they would call a comprehensive approach to migration management in the country. This is embodied in a national migration strategy which was launched in 2010 as a long-term response to dealing with so-called irregular arrivals on the Canary Islands. It's drawn up by EU technical experts and envisions a range, a kind of sweeping range of projects beneath each of its four so-called strategic axes. One such project that was implemented within the framework of the fourth strategic axis aimed at controlling migration flows included the objective of upgrading Mauritania's border infrastructure. So this meant in certain parts of the country that new border posts would be constructed from scratch, while in others it meant modernizing existing border posts with new, clearly demarcated entry and exit points, and equipping them with passport scanners and visa issuing machines and biometric identification technology. So for this reason, this latter reason of equipping and modernizing entry and exit points with biometric identification technology, this particular aspect of externalization in Mauritania came into contact with a distinct process that was unfolding at the same time in the country. And I'm here talking about the biometric overhaul of the civil registry system. So to give a bit of background, in 2009, the government awarded a tender to French biometric solutions company in order to provide a biometric solution for securing national identity documents. This results in the creation of a state agency within the Ministry of Interior called the Agence Nationale des Registres des Populations et des Titres Sécurisés, by governmental decree on the 27th of June 2010. Now, it's financed by the state at a cost of 18 million euro, and I think it's worth noting that this separates it from the context of Senegal, where a biometrics project is, I believe, being financed by the EU Trust Fund. In Mauritania, on the other hand, it was a state-funded initiative. So in this light, this biometrics project is at least formally distinct and perhaps even independent from the externalization process. Now, that said, there is a shared logic between externalization and the biometric overhaul, because the ANRPTS has played a central role within this newly constituted field of migration management in the country. According to the decree that I showed on the previous slide, a central element of the ANRPTS remit is registering and updating identification data of citizens and foreign nationals residing in or in transit through Mauritania. A member of the agency's public relations team also underscored its utility to the externalization process when we met, emphasizing that their database has meant that they could have been able, quote, have been able to assist the state in managing migration flows. And within the framework of the ANRPTS and the overhaul of the civil registry, a biometric residence permit was also introduced for foreign nationals in 2012. And this has been, I think, the most important aspect of the overlap between the biometric civil registry and the externalization process, because the residence permit has been the key means by which this external EU prerogative of preventing so-called irregular migration became absorbed within the domestic policy landscape and within the practices of the security forces, because it was on grounds of this residence permit or its lack thereof that raids and deportations became widespread in a variety of urban centers in Mauritania since 2012. So this is all just to say that there is this strong shared logic, a coherence between externalization on the one hand and the biometric civil registry on the other, despite their formal institutional distinction. Now, that said, there have also been substantial ruptures between the state and EU actors over the specific way that the biometric overhaul was rolled out. And even, and more specifically, the alleged appropriation by Mauritanian state actors of an externally created database by the ANRPTS. So, according to certain EU officials that I interviewed, the ANRPTS had simply taken an entry-exit database that had been developed with a lot of intensive labor by external experts who were working as part of the border infrastructure project. And the ANRPTS took this database and appropriated it for its own national documentation purposes. And this resulted in a temporary suspension of cooperation with the Mauritanian government in the equipping of border posts. As you can see in the frustrated quote here, quote, "We continue to construct border posts, but we don't equip them with software or materials or anything, because this agency says it's going to take responsibility. Take it, and us, we're not going to help." So there is this national agency, the ANRPTS, that's financed by the state and whose operations and perceived lack of cooperation with the dictates of externalisation kind of frustrated their EU partners. So all of this, I think, indicates that external migration control prerogatives can be appropriated and manipulated by state officials who have their own agendas. There is one other side to this story, though, that I'll briefly unfurl before wrapping up. And it is an important element, and it's namely the EU border security industrial complex. So I mentioned earlier that the government, when it was planning to establish this biometric overhaul, it issued an international tender for biometric services to be provided to the ANR-PTS. And it was Morpho that was awarded this international tender. I think this company has been named Edemia since 2012 or thereabouts. But to give it some background, it's a subsidiary of French aerospace and defense company Safran, which specializes in biometric identification systems and operates in a number of other African contexts, including Mali and Egypt, as discussed in this report by Mark Ackerman from 2021, I think. Now, in this report, he also discusses the European Organization for Security, which is one of the main lobby organizations of the European security industry in Brussels, which means that it has a key role to play in expanding the market for its particular security products by influencing and trying to shape EU foreign and security policy according to its commercial interests. It has two working groups, according to Ackerman, devoted to this task, one of which is co-chaired by a member of Morpho's board of directors. So I guess there is some EU officials in Nouakchott who were upset about how the ANR-PTS was rolled out. But the fact that it was rolled out in the first place was of direct benefit to another European official who occupies this space between the European security industry and its lobbying arm in Brussels. But beyond these just kind of individual connections, I think it's worth dwelling kind of more deeply on the fact that the ANR-PTS opened a new digital resource frontier to the European security industry. Now, scholars, and this is something I'm still kind of thinking about conceptually, but scholars from a number of disciplines have been drawing attention to the increasingly central role of data extraction within contemporary capitalism and how these intersect with migration and border policies. So Ruben Anderson, who I'm sure we all know through his work on the illegality industry in West Africa, has more recently been writing about the bioeconomy, in which life itself becomes a new terrain of capital accumulation. Nick Cozy and Ulysses Mayes also speak of data colonialism, which highlights data as a new terra nullis, a new novel empty frontier that's required, that's a necessary condition of capital expansion. Tommaso Grossi and Lucilla Leprati echo this perspective and highlight the continuities between the digital census data projects, such as the ANR-PTS in Mauritania, and colonial population mapping techniques. So in this light, the contract that Morpho won to provide the Mauritanian government with biometric technology services fits within a longer and probably quite familiar history in which European capital in the metropole extracts raw material from its colonial periphery while selling its finished product back to the periphery, except that now the raw material is population data and the product is these biometric solutions. So to quickly conclude, the biometric civil registry system is institutionally distinct from, but logically aligned with the externalization process in Mauritania, distinct insofar it was financed by the state and even departed from the wishes of certain EU officials in the way that its rollout occurred and the appropriation of externally created databases that it involved, but logically aligned with it insofar as the biometric residence permit in particular was a key means by which the EU and Spanish concern with policing irregular migration could have been justified in the Mauritanian context, and the deportations that are associated with that external prerogative could be carried out in the Mauritanian context. Now, there have been ruptures, as I say, between the agents of externalization and the ANRPTS, and this indicates that state actors can and do appropriate and even manipulate external migration control prerogatives, in particular those of Spain and the European Union. But at the same time, the ANRPTS highlights an ongoing center-periphery relationship between Europe and West Africa, with the latter being a source of raw material for the European security industry. And what I'd like to maybe think further on my own about, or collectively, is what it means that the state agency can be enacted in a fashion that reproduces this broader, perhaps we might say, neo-colonial structure. So I will leave it there. Thank you very much again for the invitation and the attention, and I welcome any comments.
Thank you very much for this wonderful and so insightful presentation, where you actually managed to make it very clear where the different actors stand in such a complex and intricate scheme. So thank you very much for this. I think it was very useful for everyone. So do we have any questions so far? If not, maybe I can start, and then sure.
There's a question from Leonie.
Ah, I'm sorry. I think she was like in the chat. No, I think she was clapping with a
My apologies.
So maybe just as a way to break the ice, I wanted to ask you whether and how you managed to study the data journey of the systems you're talking about and you're analyzing, both the civil registry but also the resident permit system, because from what we see from the literature, and also from more very different empirical studies, is that we have a number of actors that increasingly work in digitalizations of borders at large. So we have the private sector, as you mentioned, external actors, internal agencies and ministries that have different priorities, etc. And I was wondering whether this has an impact on how the data travels in a way along these systems, and whether it was possible for you to actually have a clear understanding on who is the property of the data, both in fact and by law, in theory, so to say, and who can access this data, how this data can be shared, and what are the challenges that you're facing in studying this aspect. Thank you so much.
Sure. Should I respond now, or do you want to take the one other question that's there?
As you prefer.
I'll quickly respond because I don't have a long answer. I think this is one thing that I have been thinking about in retrospect, but wasn't actively researching. The research is more the institutions and the actors and an ethnography of kind of lived experience, and less where the digital doubles of the actual people that I was talking to, where their data ends up, or whether it ends up anywhere. I would, as part of this caveat, maybe say people like Philippe Fraud, Elise here, or Romour Chilita have all kind of looked at these things in a lot more detail than I. But people that I spoke to, state officials and international officials in Mauritania, did express frustration about a low level of, well, interoperability between different institutions charged with gathering this data, and a low level of connection of at the national territorial scale of the data. So some border posts do have these biometric fingerprint scanners, and they have the visa issuing machines. So as soon as anybody passes through them, like the one in Russell, for example, or the Nouakchott International Airport, this is the two places that an IOM personal identification registration system biometric pilot program was rolled out. So at those two places, all of that data goes straight to the DGSN, the Direction Générale de Sécurité Nationale, and any international agencies with which they have are plugged into. But then there are other border posts, especially on the eastern border, where the machinery has either not been included in the modernization program, or if the internet connection is not reliable enough to actually transfer the data back to the DGSN in Nouakchott. So yeah, I don't know, but from my conversations with other actors that should have that knowledge, my impression is that even in that space, it's quite difficult.
Thank you very much. Maybe Camille Cassarini?
Yes, thank you. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it partially answered to my question, but yes, it was about in which way, in which measure this device is used in all the population in transit and in Mauritania, actually, because we already know that this kind of device is very unequal in its implementation. So my question is if now there are some space, uncontrolled space in this, but it partially answered. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, there definitely are still vast uncontrolled spaces. I think the eastern border with Mali that I mentioned, but that space is also being controlled and subject to more data gathering just over the past 4 or 5 years. So I didn't mention in the presentation, but there is a refugee camp on the border with Mali called Mbera that houses about 80,000 Malian refugees. The government in 2018 decided to issue all residents and newly arrived people in Mbera with formal refugee ID cards that were issued by the ANRPTS, the civil registry that I mentioned. So now, as of 2018, all of the people arriving there will, in theory, be integrated into the same civil registry, which is kind of from the way that I've been looking at these developments, an interesting departure, because my main association with the migration control aspect of the ANRPTS has been very much its connection to the desire to prevent arrivals on the Canary Islands, and through the biometric residence permit, it has been used to that effect. Now, however, it's also serving the purpose of registering and identifying Malian refugees who are fleeing northern and central Mali and arriving in Mbera, but some of them also travel to Nouakchott. So that's one kind of area in which there has been an increase. I think for scholars, the more interesting areas are the unpoliced and uncontrolled spaces, of which there are, I'm guessing, still many on the eastern border, but I haven't looked into it too deeply.
Thank you very much. And Judd, thank you again for this presentation.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
I have a question.
Please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Cecilia, and I'm writing a PhD on voting, biometric voting in Senegal and Kenya. And I'd like to ask, I mean, I'm not sure where this question is going to go, but I have an issue with the, I mean, we all try to frame this whole thing as colonialism because we want to stress the power force, the power relation that is happening. But what I'm trying to think about is how historically the biometric technology itself and the industry arrived and raised actually after the arrival of African and global South population in the regime of global citizenship. Because during colonization, the majority of African people were not citizens and were not allowed to move that much. So when democracy arrived, citizenship democratized, and thus the biometric industry, the biometric technology constitute, and the biometric industry raised and became what it is today. So I'd like you to discuss a bit, which different type of notion of colonialism we want to develop, and biometric isn't more related to democratization, to the end of colonialism. Thanks. By the way, it was very, very nice. And I also would like you to tell us if you have been publishing around this research.
Sure. Thanks for that. Yeah. There's a lot of things that I could say to this, because I do grapple with this question myself. I think Achille Mbembe has made a similar point about biometrics, and he, of course, is all for highlighting the ongoing legacies and effects of colonialism. But if I recall correctly, he did have something similar to say about it being, if not a tool of democracy, then at least state sovereignty, of post-colonial African state sovereignty. I would be reluctant to associate it with democracy per se, maybe neoliberalism more so. I don't really delve into the Foucauldian lens or perspective too deeply, but I think the question of biometrics really does show that he was very prescient about his discussion of biopolitics and the body being the site of political intervention, as distinct from territory or discipline, or whatever the earlier modes of governance were. I think that does seem extraordinarily prescient and compelling when you look at the logic of biometrics, which is just to take these features of the body, which are both unique to the individual but also universal and shared across all of humanity, and to use these features as tools of governance. I don't immediately see a democratic or a sovereignty perspective to it, but I definitely take the point that it's something that didn't exist during the colonial era in that form. And I think that there is, it can be a scholarly reflex to just look for what is familiar from the past to try and explain the present, when in fact perhaps the best objective, but some of the more interesting insights can be gained from looking at what is new in the present. So I do really take the point of questioning, just drawing these straight lines between the colonial past and the present, which I'll definitely think about how to navigate or avoid in the context of this paper. But yeah, I wouldn't link biometrics to democracy per se, and I would be happy to share some articles that are around this topic that I've published already.
Sabina and
Hi. Hi, thank you so much for this very, very interesting and relevant presentation. So my question is possibly related to everyday life. I was wondering, in the everyday life of migrants in transit, or especially you are talking about a civil registry, is it connected with regularizations campaigns also for migrants? And then to what extent that changes the life, and how having that kind of biometric registry intervenes in everyday practices? And also, by the way, asking how regularization works in Mauritania, in the sense that is it easy to extend, or it is once and for all exercise, like comparing with Morocco? Thank you.
Will I go straight ahead? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Yeah, there wasn't any relationship between regularization when I was doing field work, which is 6 years ago now, which pains me to say. At that moment, the relationship between the residence permit and everyday life was very much one of repression and violence. The word séjour was the kind of the shorthand that was used by both police and by migrants themselves to talk about the experience of a police van arriving up and bundling a bunch of people into it and then bringing them to a detention center where they would either be bribed and stay in the country or get deported. More recently, though, in July 2022, a regularization campaign was launched, which entailed purpose-built registry centers being opened in the Olympic Stadium, and a kind of information campaign to let everybody know that the fee, which is normally 30,000 ouguiyas, which is about €75, that fee, which when I was doing research was the main obstacle to anybody in the informal economy being able to regularize themselves, that fee was waived in this regularization campaign in July 2022, and people were invited to register. Upwards of, I think, 100,000 people did, and were issued with residence permits that were valid for a year, I believe. So I don't know, it's just coming up on a year now. The window is July to November, so it is a year since that policy was launched. I don't know what will become of those who did regularize now, whether it will be easier to renew. And I've also heard anecdotal reports that even during that year, there was an increase in crackdowns on anybody who didn't have a permit at that time. So I think that the regularization and cracking down on so-called irregular migration kind of went hand in hand.
Thank you very much. Leonie?
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Hassan, for the presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I also really enjoy the conceptual contribution that you make, framing it as data as raw material, and then this whole process of economic relations as reproduced there. And I think I just have like more conceptual question to unpack that more, and maybe it's not something you have to answer now too, but you can, of course, and maybe it's just like a thought from my side that I'd like to share. I was just wondering, data is a very immaterial raw material in a way, right? And how would you unpack that further? Like, are you going to put more conceptual work into that, how we can think about data as raw material? And then also building on that, I was thinking a lot of the migration governance process, right? Like in general, is reproducing very similar kind of relationships where a lot of the projects are often implemented and funded, and then the implementing partner are the ones that receive the funding, and those those actors are often not from the West African continent. So I think you could even, if you want to make that argument, you could even extend that argument more widely. Or if you don't do that, maybe say what is specific about data versus the other implementing actors, which are doing migration governance in West Africa and who work in very similar, I would say, economic relations, or reproduce similar economic relations. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Leonie. I don't think I do have a response off the top of my head, apart from, raw material data as a very immaterial raw material. I think is a really fascinating insight. The literature that I kind of really cursorily listed at the end is just what I'm kind of dipping into. So I'll definitely look into whether the last point has been made and what it means for, materialist analysis, which is definitely what I'm, and other kind of Marxian influenced approaches try to do, what it means to have such an immaterial objective analysis. And again, the specificity of data as opposed to the other actors that are engaged in similar kind of neo-colonial relations, most notably Civipol, with that you and Eva Magdalena Istanbul have written brilliantly about. I would also need to think more about, but there are certainly really interesting comparisons to be made. So thanks.
Super interesting. Thank you so much, Leonie, as well. Actually, I have a bad and a good news. The bad one is that our second speaker, we won't be able to join us. The good one is that we have plenty of time for the discussion, though. So please, Cecilia Vassanti, go ahead.
Good news for you.
Nice. So I would like, Hassan, I would like to ask you if you speak with someone from the national agencies from the biometric civil identification. How do they understand the fact that there are shared logics and practice between migration and civil identification? Because from my field work in Dakar, I've been talking just with a few people working in biometrization or digitalization of civil registries, and they actually know. I mean, they are actually very aware of the fact that the EU is putting so many money in biometrics for civil identification just because they want to somehow build interoperability. And they said, just a few people, they said, yes, we know, but I mean, they don't like it, but they're like, yes, anyway, we need the money for building, say, a civil registry, and that's it. Did you manage to speak with some people?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I did. Well, only one in that agency, and then a couple of other officials in other ministries. And their attitude reminded me a bit of on the one hand, the kind of the biometric ideal that and the promise that Philippe Freud talks about in the context of Senegal. It has this allure that doesn't even need to be justified with reference to anything like democracy or sovereignty or citizenship or anything. It's just so modern and shiny that it nearly justifies its own existence. And that was definitely the way that it was framed as this agent of modernization and progress that you would be foolish not to embrace. That was how it was framed by this individual in that agency and others I've spoken to. But there didn't seem to be as much of attention as it seems that there was in Senegal, and that might be because of the fact that it was something that was financed by the state. Now, if I look into the nitty-gritty of EU budget support, I'm not sure if different connections could be drawn, but on paper it wasn't something that was imposed by the outside on the state. It was something that came about in part due to satisfying the requirements of policing irregular migration, but also in order to modernize the electoral registry and to indirectly consolidate the power of the local elite, because this isn't something I went into much detail here, but I've written about elsewhere. other communities in Mauritania, Afro-Mauritanian communities in particular, so Wolof, Fonike, Fulani populations in particular, encountered a lot of difficulties in even those who were, you know, born on Mauritanian soil. It was quite common for them to be treated with utmost suspicion when they would go to a civil registry office and ask for a birth cert or a passport. They were generally assumed to not be really Mauritanian. So the agency was an indirect tool of reasserting the dominance of a particular ethnic and racial group in Mauritania, and for that reason could have been a source of subconscious pride rather than something that was a sign of their subordination to the interests of European security actors, as is the case in Senegal. Even if, as I've tried to argue, there was this other European beneficiary in the form of the French and European military-industrial complex, security-industrial complex.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Casarino.
Yeah, thank you, Hassan. Really, I liked this analogy that you make between, let's say, the extractive attitude, let's say, of former colonial powers, and the way in which this, you know, biometric issue is managed currently, you know. And I think that it's really, I think it's to the point. It's really relevant to some extent. It's a really good analogy. Regarding this analogy, I would like to ask you something. When you did your interview with people working for the population registry, did you ask them what they think about, you know, this framework of cooperation, which, let's say, well, maybe draws, you know, as maybe you try to make them understand, you know, draws on some neo-colonial attitudes? I mean, did they react, or do they believe that it's unimportant? Do they have their own strategy saying, well, look, you know, locally, this is, you know, the official picture, but locally, we can re-elaborate our own, you know, I would like to know your take. I have another question afterwards, but
Sure. Will I respond to this one first? Yeah. Okay, so regarding, I didn't ask them, the actors within that agency in particular, this particular question. So I would be speculating if I were to say exactly how they felt about the potential neo-colonial nature of the relationship between the agency and the companies that provide the biometric services. But the comment definitely does make me think about within other ministries, a certain form, I don't want to say superficial, well, maybe a superficial form of anti-colonialism that you can see within the civil service and within elites across other West African contexts too, which involves a surface level rejection of perceived agents of neocolonialism, but a reluctance to address the broader structural features, broader neocolonial features that continue to connect Mauritania in this case and Europe. So what I'm thinking about mainly is people in the Ministry of Interior would say that, yes, we always have difficulties in working with our French counterparts because they don't like to be told what to do by the French. But when the Spanish are here, even though the deployment of Spanish Civil Guard forces on Mauritanian state territory with the power to check people's documents is a pretty neo-colonial situation. but just the fact that it's Spanish forces and not French. If it were French, it would be
Or
intolerable.
it's more acceptable, let's say, when
Yeah.
it's done by the Spaniards, let's say.
Yeah,
Let's put it this way.
exactly. Yeah. And I imagine their impression would be, well, no, if I don't like the legacies of colonialism, it's not really to do with the fact that we're exporting raw materials and importing processed goods or anything. You need to do business in some way, shape, or form, but there's just this more kind of superficial way of not wanting to be obviously told and lectured at. I think the kind of aesthetics of a former civil servant or a civil servant from a former colonial power telling a civil servant in Mauritania what to do, that might be uncomfortable and objectionable, but a business contract that is still a neo-colonial one in terms of the terms of trade that it enshrines is less objectionable, I think.
Definitely. May I ask my second question, if it's not too okay, very quickly? Have you undertaken any kind of, let's say, more, I would say, more comparative approach to this phenomenon regarding, you know, the digitalization, well, biometrics, and is there a comparison that you are investigating, you know, in your research between Mauritania and Senegal? Or I'm asking you because when I was listening to you, you know, inevitably, you know, I thought about Tunisia, which under the former dictatorship of Zine El Abidine Ben Ali had a very well developed biometric system of identity. Why? Because it was a dictatorship, but a very violent dictatorship. And so the regime was extremely adamant about registering everybody in order, I mean, for the sake of domination. I mean, there's no need to explain. Anyway, and this biometric database is very much, how would I say, coveted by the European, as I'm sure you can imagine. I mean, after the revolution, believe me, after the revolution, most European powers were interested in, you know, the biometric database, the, you know, based on automated fingerprint, fingerprint identity system, you know, the AFIS. This is how it is called. Maybe the acronym is not. Yes, that's the one. Identity system, exact identification system, the AFIS, actually. And Italy, for example, was extremely eager to get access, you know, to this database. Absolutely. Now, to be honest with you, I'm not really informed about what happened, whether this access was possible. But anyway, there are commitments which were made by the Italian authorities in exchange of technological assistance, surveillance system, even after the revolution. Okay. Right? Because it's all connected. And of course, a very much lucrative business behind it, with Leonardo, which was Leonardo is the equivalent of Safran, you know, which was eager also to cooperate with the Tunisian post-revolutionary authorities in order, you know, to upgrade well, this database, etc. Now, what happened, I don't know, to be honest with you, but I was interested in, you know, this comparison between a country like, you know, Mauritania, which, tell me whether I understood well or correctly, did not have any biometric database before that. That's the new one, really. Okay, in Tunisia, it existed before the revolution. Actually, just to give you an idea, the technology was very well advanced. And so I'm wondering whether you could draw a kind of comparison between these two different contexts. You know, on the one hand, Mauritania, which needs anyway the assistance of European, you know, companies, you know, working in the security sector in order, you know, of course, with the intermediation of various countries, maybe France, maybe Spain or others, anyway, in order, Europe, of course, in order to fund, you know, these databases. And on the other side, we have Tunisia, which had already its own national biometric database. You know, how was it built? I don't know, really. We have to investigate. I don't know. With the help of which companies, how the technologies came in Tunisia in order to be, I don't know. Maybe it was Tunisian, because there's anyway, we have skills over there. And well, it's interesting maybe to draw this comparison. I'm just thinking about it, you know. That's it. But if you have something to say, otherwise it's just a suggestion, you know, nothing more.
Thanks. Yeah, I haven't done it in any kind of a systematic fashion, just the kind of observational comparisons between Senegal, where it is financed externally, and then Mauritania, where it's not, and Morpho that has provided similar services in Egypt and in Mali, at least, and probably elsewhere.
Yeah.
I do think that Tunisia comparison is interesting, though, just because of they're on opposite
the
ends
contrast.
Of a
it's a
spectrum.
full
Yeah,
contrast.
exactly.
You know?
Yeah. So
it's not a country which depends on external technologies, you know. Well, maybe today does, I don't know. Anyway, but at the time when it was created, this was a fully fledged Tunisian biometric database for, let's say, I mean, aimed at serving, well, the domination of a regime. This is how it went. Anyway.
Speaks to the not very democratic nature, I guess, or potential of that technology.
Of course, yeah.
If there are no other questions, maybe I have a short one. Yes. Thank you again for this fascinating discussion. I think also the theoretical debates around these issues is key, and there's still much to be done in these terms. So I think your contributions will be extremely important in this direction. I was wondering, so from what I'm studying, most of the systems, maybe with the exception of civil registries, but I'm not sure, are built to have some sort of target population. So you do data extraction when you have a target, which is usually quite specific. And this also, the fact of having a target makes the comparison with colonial legacies, colonial continuities in digital realm more clear. So you have a target, and you targeting that specific part of the population, you are trying to exert some sort of governance or specific form of control of that population. I was wondering whether you see this dynamic also in the civil registry. I guess that, for example, for the residence permit, this is more clear, but potentially also with ID cards and with just civil registry, this is possible. I was thinking of the case of Kenya, where the Supreme Court ruled out the biometric ID card because it's exclusionary results that somehow are the consequence of a specific idea of targeting of a given population.
Yeah, I mean, in formal terms, you know, in the words of the decree that created the civil registry, the target population is just everybody residing on the national territory, whether it's citizens or foreign nationals. In the view of certain Afro-Mauritanian campaigners, this was a targeted exclusion designed to continue the racial marginalization of non-Arabic speakers And there is a history of expulsions between Mauritania and Senegal that goes back to the 1980s that I can go into more detail on, but the short version is that there's a history of exclusion of non-Arabic speakers and even expulsion and deportation of non-Arabic speakers. That was renewed through this biometric civil registry. I think one group even called it a biometric genocide or something to this effect, or because, as I said, the experience of so many non-Arabic speakers when they would go to get a birth cert or a passport was to be treated with a vast amount of suspicion compared to an Arabic speaker who it would just be assumed was Mauritanian. In the 1980s, there was a policy of expulsions and like ethno-national purification. Now, I think it's harder to say that that is a specific objective, but more an outcome. In the view of certain human rights activists I've interviewed, at least, they would say no, it's not intentional, but it was just built into the way that the biometric system was rolled out and the way that the people who staffed the civil registry centers were trained. They have this kind of bias built into them, and it kind of reproduced itself at the kind of the street level. But in any case, the result was similar to what you're saying in Kenya, a exclusion of a already disenfranchised population.
Thank you so much. Do we have any other comments, questions?
So I'd like to know if what do you know about the voter registry? Does the biometric the electoral file, and if they does they extract? They have the civil registry from where they extract the voter registry, or what? Because concerning the comparative thing, I've seen that in Kenya and Senegal both, even if they have very different realities, both well, political, social, and technical. This extractive thing exists since the 2010.
I haven't excuse me, I haven't looked into that in particular. Or actively, I guess, but I have seen that one of the justifications for the creation of the biometric system was to modernize the electoral register and the electoral process. And I know that now when you go to vote, you need to present a ID card, which is one of these biometric ID cards. And there's been all sorts of ways that it's related to voter manipulation and allegations of fraud. But yeah, I don't know how central the voter registration was as a goal in the creation of in the rolling out of the biometric system, but it certainly does now. It's certainly featured as one of the justifications, and it does now play a key role in insofar as the ID cards are required in order to vote.
I see.
Yeah, so I'll have to look into it more. But thanks for raising.
I don't know if we have any final question, maybe. Other than the promise that we will keep you updated on the publication of the monography and potentially on new articles that we are very much looking forward to read.
I'd be more than happy to. Yeah, I will for sure. And it was a pleasure and very enjoyable. I really got a lot out of those questions. And it is just a pity that Agnes couldn't be here as well, because it would have been very nice to see the exchange and overlaps between the two. But in any case, that was really, really enjoyable for me. So thank you.
Thank you very much again. I think I'll give the floor to Delphine, maybe, to close the meeting, or to Jean-Pierre Casarino.
Well, no, again, thank you to Hassan for this really, I would say, stimulating discussion, you know, even for those who, like me, are not familiar with Mauritania, but again, are seeing some bridges, you know, between, you know, other, I would say, national contexts. And for me, it was really enriching also to listen to you. So thank you. Nothing more to say. If you want to join us in the framework of POMAF, just, you know, you have the I sent to you the website, the address of our let's say research and discussion forum that we are trying to promote on migration policies in Africa. And so if you want to be informed about our activities, do not hesitate to contact us, and we'll be glad to share with you our future activities.